Your investors are not going to build your company for you, so don't expect that. And people who expect too much of their investors are perpetually unhappy and are the people you always hear complaining about stuff. They didn't fund me for this reason. They didn't help me with that. Like, your job is to make the company successful no matter what, and investors are not going to do that for you. You want cheerleaders. You're building a community. You're trying to will something impossible into the world. So I have always had the approach of adding people to the cap table as teammates that add value in some way while keeping low expectations. So I will always find a way. If someone wants to put in 10 million, put in 9, give me $1 million, and I'll split that up with 20 people. Each of them will add something to our company that I might not need on a day-to-day basis, but they're there to call on. And by the way, they build extremely good long-term relationships if you know how to handle it. So that's how I think about it.
Hello, friends. It's me, Deepak Chhugani, avid rock climber, startup founder, and yes, podcast host. I wanted to start off this episode by highlighting a few reviews that came in recently. There's one from Jenny Stone that says, "This podcast has quickly become one of my favorite listens. The host, Nima, engages the top-notch guests in thought-provoking, insightful conversations. I always walk away with a new idea and invaluable marketing and growth tactics." And there's one from Skylight37 saying, "Love the idea of having two different perspectives, intakes on various topics, and what makes it stand out more in the little insightful details during the podcast that makes understanding a certain topic more crucial." Thank you for submitting those reviews, Jenna Stone and Skylight37. It is extremely meaningful to know that people are actually enjoying these podcasts, and knowing that it's not just me who enjoys doing them. Show the show some love and give us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and tell us what you love most about our show. All right, this week's guest is Deepak Chagani, the founder of Nuvocargo, a freight forwarding marketplace focused on the LATAM corridor. I met Deepak years ago through Y Combinator. We were both struggling to figure out what sort of company to build, and we were part of an amazing group of founders meeting up every 2 weeks to introspect on our process. He's been a close friend and confidant ever since. You may have heard part of Deepak's story, how after his first company, The Lobby, didn't pan out, he returned all the money he received from investors because in his mind, it was the right thing to do. But that's only part of his story. Deepak shares who his main influence was in starting Nuvocargo, why he chose to go the YC route, how he solves the complexity of running a B2B marketplace, and his belief that organizational design is flawed by design. Deepak was super open about his startup journey. I learned so much more about him after this interview. I hope you learned a few things too. He starts by sharing how it all began.
My parents are from India, so born and raised, both of them. Grew up their whole lives there. And my dad in his late 20s, early 30s, all of his cousins, they were trying to make it in the world. They were trying to find, success in business. And the opportunity back then, if you were kind of a young Asian man at that time, you could basically find manufacturers in Asia and help them find customers in countries all over the world. So it's really interesting. His generation of cousins, he has cousins in Africa, in Europe, in Panama, and all sorts of random places where they all just moved and became kind of the Asian connection for local retailers. And so my dad did that a little bit in Panama and then found an opportunity to start his own company doing this in Ecuador. And so basically for 35 years, he built a small business, which has since shut down, but a business that basically was helping if you're a local school supply store retailer and you need a connection in China or India to buy your supplies and connect with manufacturers, and then help you with the logistics of moving the goods from that origin to where you were, he would help you with a lot of those logistics and even help you with things around working capital and financing and more. So I grew up in Ecuador my whole life, from 0 to like age 17 until I went to college. My parents were like good Indian parents, pretty obsessed. My kid should go to the US for college. We were never able to. My dad actually had a year where he tried to do his master's in North Carolina, living with family, but he was like working 16 hours a day and studying and driving around, and he just left because it wasn't working and it was a little bit too difficult, just from a financial standpoint and not having enough time to actually be a student. So they had this visceral feeling and dream, my kids are going to study in the US. So his whole priority was not, around superfluous things with the money that he made. It was like, I'm just going to save up so my kids can go to the US. And I went to the American school in Guayaquil, Ecuador. That's where I grew up. And the environment was what I just mentioned. It was, even though everyone locally was going to these Roman Catholic schools, very weird. If you were in the international school, it was very weird and antisocial. It had different calendars than everyone else, but it was all about the best possible education, like a good Indian family. And then I was able to come to the US in 2010 for college in a small school called Bentley, a business school right on the outskirts of Boston. Lots of Latin Americans there, so it felt like home. Amazing academic environment. Got to meet a bunch of people, and then I'm happy to go deeper if you want. But then
And so these did you call it American schools or just language schools, like
no,
English language?
like an American school. Like my school was part of what's called SACS, like an accreditation of American schools I think in South America or maybe everywhere. My school was the one where everyone would go and study for the SAT if you wanted to go to the US in that city. But it was just a very weird school from a social standpoint is kind of the point, right?
Yeah. We had some of those in Iran. I didn't go to them, but basically English speaking classes. And
yeah, exactly.
Like and you're doing like, what were you doing? IB or?
IB was more British. We were doing AP, like the US system. And there were some British and German schools, and they were doing IB. Ours was the only American one that had a different calendar and did AP. And like I said, helped you with the SAT and stuff like that.
Was that from the beginning? Like from which school, primary school onwards, you were in these types of schools?
Basically from K to 12, and then nursery was another school, but that was like the only American school. And my parents, there was actually a time when I was 15 where all of my friends were changing to these like Catholic schools because the social life was better. And we always felt like the weird kids throughout the whole city. And my parents are very proud of this. I don't think there's many times where you can say to your parents, hey, this one decision, like the thing you didn't let me do was a very good decision. I made their life miserable for 2 years because all of my best childhood friends were changing to these schools. And they'd said, I'm not letting you. And I actually thank them for that today. That's one thing that probably, I really am grateful to them for. Whereas all the other stuff they didn't let me do, I probably still as a kid was like, you should have let me.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing of like the standard of, it's interesting because you grew up in an Eastern culture because your parents were from the East. And like, I grew up in the same culture of like the American standard. Like everyone's goal was to eventually make it to America.
Yes.
And I think there's a friend of mine who's also in America recently, like tweeted on her 30th birthday or something that she gets to be in this country, and no one understands unless you're from the other parts of the world how important this achievement is of like being a citizen of America. I'm not a citizen, but she is now. It's quite interesting. So,
but by the way, on that, like for me, something people are always focused on the startup world, like, how much money did you raise? How big is your team? And whatever. For me, one of the biggest and happiest moments was getting my green card because I had gone through like 6 visas and like impossible processes. My wife, who was then my girlfriend, also had to leave the country. So not only is it like the dream, it's also really hard as an immigrant to live here. So I totally empathize with that. Yeah,
then there's like an interesting thought I've always had of there is like probably some form of investment strategy of just investing in the immigrants that were able to figure out the visa stuff to be here. Because it's not easy. They don't make it easy for startup founders to get visas in this country.
It's super difficult. And I think it's a very bad move. Like it's draining a lot of great talent. One of our investors, One Way Ventures in Boston, their whole thesis is around immigrant entrepreneurs, and they help them with the visa stuff. And even they'll tell you it's just a nightmare.
Oh my God. Yeah. I mean, I deal with it. We're 3 founders, all immigrants, and it's quite a lot of work, and it's very stressful. Every year we have to renew these things. And it's interesting. So your whole life was kind of like pre-planned that you're going to study in America. And so you said you went to Boston?
Yeah, I went to a small business school called Bentley University in Waltham, Massachusetts, which is like a 15-minute drive from downtown Boston. So very near this incredible academic environment with Harvard and MIT. And again, this school, beautiful greenery, it was awesome. It was transformed my life, right? Just being there.
So why business? Why were you gravitating towards that?
I mean, I think maybe it's how I grew up. Like my dad had done well as a business person, and I couldn't really find an interest. I was a good student. I was grade skipped from 6th to 8th grade. So I was like the canonical good Indian kid until 8th grade. And then I started rebelling and being a bad student. And I had teachers who would say, Deepak, horrible student, but I think he's going to do well in business. And I had this stereotype that I was just going to be a business guy, I guess. Yeah, I mean, going back, I would have loved to have been pushed in the direction to learn some harder skill like computer science or something like that. But at the time, it just felt like business. And I didn't really study business. I felt I don't want to study business as a major. I'd rather do something tangential to that. So it ended up being economics and finance, which to me is kind of business, but not really. If it's not like, it's not a degree in business. It's economics and finance. And
those skills are actually, in my opinion, more useful than business school. If you want to start a company, it's probably like better if you're doing business school and you want to be a middle manager somewhere and run existing companies. So if you want to start from scratch, like just knowing how to build a spreadsheet for a budget takes you a long way.
Yeah, exactly. 100%.
Yeah. So you started a business in undergrad. Did you do masters or anything like that, or you just went to the workforce?
No, I didn't. But it's an interesting topic with my family because so I went to school 2010 to 2014. 2014 to about 2016, I was in investment banking at B of A Merrill Lynch. That was like a big deal for my parents because it was like the shiny corporate job. Also, most kids from my school, Bentley, they don't get those jobs in investment banking because it's all like Ivy League. So that was like a whole mission and a nice accomplishment. And then a lot of people who you're with in banking, they'll do a couple more years and then they'll go to business school. And for me, that was like, oh, this is my chance to finally. The American dream for my parents wasn't about money. It was like, well, maybe you'll do your master's at Harvard or Stanford or something. So that was always very present. When I quit that job and I took a little sabbatical, one of the things I did was take the GMAT because I thought, hey, I'll try a startup, and if it doesn't work, maybe my hedge will be business school. And that's since expired, and I don't think I'm ever going to do it anymore. But I did not do my master's, but it was a topic that kept coming up for many, many years.
So your parents would literally talk to you about, hey, are you going to think about doing your master's? Like, what are you doing with your life?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting, like, it's like a classic thing, right? Like, I'm from Iran, right? And my parents, they never finished a single degree until much later. My mother started getting her degrees in her like 40s. So their dream was that we get degrees. And their first child, which was me, I dropped out of my undergrad. And they didn't love that. So they kept asking me to start again. But fortunately, my brother finished his undergrad at least. So there's one of us that did it. But it's an interesting sort of pressure that is put on at least our generation. I assume you're not going to do the same with your kids if you ever have them and when you have them. But it's an interesting thing that at that point, that was a definition of prestige and importance of like success in life.
I don't know how you think about this, but I actually really do understand where they're coming from. Even now in the startup world, right? Like for me, I was very lucky to get into YC, which is kind of, we met through that community. And then there's other startup communities that you learn a lot. And then as you spend a few years in the startup world and you meet many, many successful founders or investors, there are some patterns where people ended up going to a lot of the same schools and learned a lot of the same tricks and networks. So I have a lot of empathy for the immigrant parents who are like, it will really change your life to get into one of these schools. I think many people, including like, it would be in my interest to say it doesn't matter because I didn't go to one of those schools, but I actually do think that if you have the privilege to attend one of them, it can bend the trajectory of your life. Like if you look at our executive team or our board, like the amount of Stanford, MIT, Harvard grads is just off the charts. And it's not because we screen for that. It's because we're looking for people with certain experience that have seen certain things or been in certain environments. And they are in some ways centers of excellence that attract people. Like I'm sure there's a lot of dumb people that don't know anything in those schools, just like in any community. But on average, they expose you to knowledge and insights and I would say secrets about the world. That's what my first startup idea was about, actually. It was about like democratizing some of those insights because getting the Ivy League job in banking where I started from, that was really weird. And it came through all these like unstructured coffee chats and learning the secrets and the insights. So I have a lot of empathy for that. But I also, to your point, I don't think I would pressure my kids. I would actually tell them to learn the things that matter and try to find creative ways to get that information, maybe without the degree or through the degree, whatever you're able to do without being miserable, right? Because I think a lot of people also make themselves miserable if they don't go to one of those schools, which is also not good. Yeah,
and I think there's an interesting debate to have. I think, when people ask me if they should do YC, this is the argument I give them is that you're buying a network more than anything else.
And legitimacy, right? You're buying a stamp, right?
Yeah, totally. And there's a different cachet. I've seen, we started investing in funds this past year, and a lot of the decks I see are like, hey, we're only going to do Stanford and Harvard grads.
Right.
It's literally a strategy, and it's a common one. And so I definitely see it still to this day. The thing, I think I personally don't value prestige that much. I care about like building things, and like I think you can learn how to build stuff better outside of academia. So it really depends on what you're trying to do. Like some of the best people we work with in my company are like in their early 20s, and some of them dropped out of high school even, just because they're good makers, and they found their passion and are going to be, I think, the top of their field one day.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you, by the way. I think that it's not even what you learn in the classroom in these places, it's the environment and the networks, right? Like I would argue you, Nima, you didn't go to one of these schools, but you're at the top of your game. You've spoken with very smart people. You have exposure to some of the best insights in the world, like in the world of performance marketing or startups. And so someone who gets to work with you gets access to that. I think what I believe is that the odds of you getting exposed to the best of the best in any field do go up if you find the centers of excellence. It's not that you won't find them if you're just Googling them on your own. It's just you might make it much harder on yourself or have to rely a lot more on your ability to figure it out. Whereas if you're in these centers of excellence, it might just be grab a coffee with your professor who built 10 companies or whatever, right? Go to the center where they built 10 of the state-of-the-art robotics advances, or the story of Bill Gates where he was next to computers because he was in this fancy boarding school where there weren't computers elsewhere in the world, right? I think that's what I find very interesting is the centers of excellence, I think can shape the trajectory of your life in a way that if you're outside of them, it's just harder, right?
Yeah, I think I agree with that. The part of me wants to believe that if you're an outlier, you'll just get out of, like, those things won't matter, right?
Sure.
But lots of the outliers that are currently running the biggest companies in the world for sure came from those privileges. So
that's my observation as well, right? So totally agree with you.
It's definitely a thing. I think maybe Jobs was one of the only ones that didn't come out of, but he still went to like a decent school.
He was in Silicon Valley, right?
Yeah,
like,
and
that's
he was
a center of excellence,
he grew up
right?
in it. Yeah. It's an interesting area. So why investment banking? And I'm glad you stopped there, but like, what? 2 years? Why did you go there to begin with? Was it just I want to do this job that everyone thinks is the best thing to do? Like,
no, that's on point. I don't know how many people admit this on podcasts. It was probably purely out of like insecurity, intrigue of like, why is this shiny thing that even the Harvard kids, I will never forget. It was the first time in my life where I went to the final round interviews and everyone had their resumes printed out and it was all these kids and they were all from Ivy League schools and I got the job and they didn't. And so it felt almost like irresponsible not to take it and see what this was about, or I was given this unique opportunity that other people went to these amazing schools that I never got into. But I think that's what it boils down to. It's this shiny thing, investment banking. It's amazing. It's where everyone starts their career. I would devour these forums where they're like, well, if you want to be a hedge fund manager, like this guy you saw on CNBC, they started in investment banking. If you want to be in private equity. And so I thought it was, in hindsight, which hindsight is 2020, I saw it as like my first foray into trying to be in a true center of excellence, which it felt like at the time that I could access. But then I always had reservations because I knew it was like really stupid that they made you pull all-nighters and work 100 hours for PowerPoint and Excel. And so even 4 months in, I was like, I'm probably going to quit this job at some point. But I held out. I waited till the first year bonus. Then I didn't get the visa. They said, we'll send you to Mexico. I said, well, in Mexico, I'll be a second year, so I'll have more skills and we'll make another bonus and wait. And then even when I got to Mexico, I got like 3 weeks off and I started in a week and I'm like, I have to quit this crap. I don't want to do it. But I do think that's what it was, Nima. It was like my version of like, this is my center of excellence that I can have access to, the stamp. And to be honest, it has helped when I would raise the first money or get into YC. They'd be like, oh, this guy seems like he works hard. Not because he went to Bentley. Like, let's be real. He was an investment banker. Like this guy went through 2 years of hell. We knew people that literally would go to investment banking and the army, and they would say investment banking was worse because you didn't sleep. You had to function with no sleep. And so that's what it gave me, even though I really didn't love how it felt at the time. It was like, again, credibility that this is a hard worker and he could access a center of excellence, like an area where everyone is smart or went to the best centers of excellence. But I knew even 4 months in, that I wasn't going to be there forever. I was just trying to find a way out that didn't make me feel like someone who's going to have a black mark on their resume, if I'm being candid.
Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense. I think I remember starting my first company I dropped out of college and started a company and it failed. And I immediately helped another company get off the ground. And I quit that a few months in because I felt like the founders were unethical. And I remember thinking this resume problem kept creeping up in my mind. I was like, maybe I'm not an entrepreneur. That means I have to go out in the world and get jobs. And if they see I'm just hopping around every few months, it's very scary. And so building this base and foundation of people trusting that you can get stuff done. There's a mentor of mine that gave me this phrase. He said, I think you just have to show people that you can ship, because I was, engineer and product manager. And you can't do that in 3-4 months anywhere. So it was an interesting sort of advice that aligns with what you're talking about here.
And even I feel like in product and engineering, you can just show an art, or you can show what you're made of, or if you're a quant analyst, you have the best algorithms. I genuinely think that in investment banking, there is no way to differentiate. You just stay up longer than the next guy. You build a slide 5% prettier than the next person. And so it just felt like a race to the bottom of just destroying your health and not doing anything unique. So I just wanted to quit after I realized that after a few months,
That's interesting. Did you ever was there a network you acquired there that was helpful?
If I can be honest, for what I'm doing today, no. I mean, the only cool validating thing is when my former bosses have been recently inviting us back now to talk about transactions we could do with Nuvocargo, which is surreal to me. So I think it was useful that they see me as an alum of Bank of America Merrill Lynch, and I know where they're coming from, and I know the work that they do. And maybe if Nuvocargo starts buying up companies, the network of M&A bankers and raising debt and equity, maybe. But candidly, for starting up in the startup world, not really. And all the things I just told you, you probably get them anyways when you start becoming a later stage founder without you trying. People will come to you and tell you hey, we're looking to help startups in this way, right?
Yeah, makes sense. But I think the work ethic part is super useful, of going in and knowing what it's like to grind. Because I think if you haven't done that and you're starting a startup, you don't know what your limits are. And then having done it without the existential crisis of this company could die gives you this learning of okay, I know I can grind at this level and continuously do it for a long time. It's an interesting thing to have learned.
And there's many other learnings related to that. One thing we'll tell people is you as an analyst in banking, you're sending emails with attachments and specific analyses to CEOs and CFOs of multi-billion-dollar companies, and you're trying to send things to your managing directors because the teams are small. So you learn how to speak in a professional way with people that are much more senior than you. I think a lot of those skills continue to help to this day. But aside from that and work ethic, it doesn't really help you with startups, to be honest, right?
And so why, so you quit and then decided, is this at this point you knew you're going to start a company?
Yes and no, right? What I said is I want to take a little sabbatical. I don't know anything. I keep reading so much about startups, but I can only look at this stuff at 1 or 2 a.m. when I'm half asleep after work. Even weekends you would work. It's insane job. They would be protected Saturdays and you'd still be in the office on Saturdays. So I knew that there was no way I was going to learn enough to make good decisions. And so I quit. I said I had some savings from banking. That's one of the benefits. You get a bonus at the end of your first year or whatever. And I took a little sabbatical where I was reading a lot about startups. I was studying for the GMAT, like I said. And my goal was at the end of the sabbatical, quote unquote, I'm going to pick an idea and I'm going to get started. And so that's what I did. At the end of 2016, picked one idea in early 2017, I can't remember, picked an idea that was kind of a mentorship legacy thing for old people that 3 months later morphed into the lobby, which is a mentorship thing to get jobs in banking. But I did know that I wanted to start something. And this is one thing that YC always tells you not to do, don't force picking an idea. And now in a month, I'm giving a talk with them about, hey, you're the only one who we know who picked an idea and it worked. So can we talk about it?
Yeah, I definitely want to get into that because I also do. I think that is one advice you can take. It's not the only advice. And actually I'm generally into your approach. I have a couple of friends running decently strong businesses in that area. And I guess probably for just disclosure reasons, I'm an investor in Deepak for the listeners. So tell me, so you started the lobby. I remember I remember launching on Bookface. This is like the internal YC thing. And then I didn't really hear about you until you came into the YC therapy group, right? So can you just tell people what this thing is that we have?
Yeah. So the way I would describe it, I mean, again, people are not open about this stuff. I think one of the hardest parts of being a founder is managing your own psychology. And one of the ways that I've done that, and I think Nima has done that as well, is finding support groups where you can freely talk about your issues with other founders. And so Nima and I have been part of a group for, I think, more than 3 years now.
Yeah, 3 years.
We meet,
4 years.
We try to meet every 2 weeks or 3 weeks, just group of founders where they just talk about problems. Because, as a founder, you're selling absolutely everyone all the time. You can't talk about this stuff with your team, with your board. And so I think it's been a really powerful outlet and community for me as I pivoted and as my wife got deported and as we picked a new company and got it off the ground and all that. So I'm very grateful to you, Nima, specifically, and to the group that we have.
Yeah, I mean, and ditto. I think I've learned a ton from you. And you come up in we have these things called meta days, which are effectively our board meetings because we don't have a board. We don't have investors and stuff. And, and I think some of the things you say, I end up writing them down and oh yeah, Deepak said this. How could we talk about this? So, and just so we can get an understanding, what did you learn from the lobby? I don't want to focus too much on it because it was a thing you ran for a while. You found a co-founder for that, or no? It was a solo thing.
The lobby, I was a single non-tech founder. That's why I say changed my life. That YC, Jared Friedman, actually, who I'm doing the event with in Mexico City in our offices, he funded me as a single non-tech founder with an idea that every YC partner except him hated and knew probably wouldn't work because they funded 6 iterations of that idea. But basically, what the lobby was a marketplace where anyone who wanted to get a job inside one of these coveted banks or tech companies, if they didn't have a network to help you prepare for interviews or make sure you knew what interviews would be like or prepare your resume, you could spend $50 or $100 on a paid coaching call with someone who had been inside those companies, and they would do mock interviews, review your resume, and we kind of productized that into an online marketplace and got into YC with that, raised about $1.2 million for that, and then 6 months after YC pivoted because I realized it was a very bad idea.
So but you built the thing out. I remember it was some form of product. So you found engineers, you built the thing out.
I'm very proud of what we built. Actually, it worked, was fully automated. It was this extremely manual process of getting people to book and schedule and reschedule calls. And we automated all of that with the engineers that I work with. And that was an incredible experience for me doing product, which I didn't really know how to do product, right?
Yeah. And I think that's the number one important thing is going back to that advice I got when I was young is just shipping is so important. And it's so hard to ship when there is you are the main product manager. So you have to come up with everything and then figure out what has to be built. And that's a very hard skill. And it's the first one you have to learn as a founder, I think. And so when you decided to pivot, I remember you returned some of the money or just give us what did you, that's not, first of all, that's very nice of you. And I would expect the same from any founder I invest in to just say, hey, I've learned that this is not going to work and I don't think I have enough money for the next thing. So here's your money back. How did that go?
I mean, I was 24, 25. I was a nervous wreck with it. So I think in hindsight, it was handled well, but it was really the hardest thing for me at the time. But it was basically finish YC winter 2018, raise 1.2 million. We closed out in April, May. And then 6 months later, when I realized it wasn't really working and scaling, I decided I'm going to change course radically. And we still had, because we had been so frugal, or I had been so frugal, I want to say 70% of the money in the bank. So high hundreds of thousands with very low burn. So we could have kept going for a while. But I came to the conclusion that, hey, this is going to be a waste of time. And it's going to be a waste of my shot where I'm single non-tech founder, I have YC on the cap table. I'm young, I have a lot of energy. I'm not going to, if I see it's not going to work, why would I trick myself? So I made a couple of radical decisions. The first one was to bring the burn down, let go of our team. We were about 8 people, including one engineer who actually waited a few months and came back with us. He's still at Nuvocargo today. His name is Mohammed. So huge shout out to Mohammed. He's incredible for that, loyalty and sticking with us. And then it took me 2 months to pick the new idea. And that's where I went through this whole methodic process that YC wouldn't approve of. But I think now they might say that it works in the event we're going to do next month. And then when I picked the idea, I started telling some of the angels, because again, we couldn't raise from any funds. They hated the idea. It was from 41 angels, $1.2 million. And so I started calling all of them, which is probably a mistake because I was so desperate for their approval to make sure everything was okay. And I started getting mixed reactions where many of them were like, hey, we backed you, it's fine. And then others were being very negative. So I got some advice and made the decision to offer them the 70% back. Anyone could take it if they wanted to, but I was obviously lobbying on the sides of like, hey, I want the ones who are being loyal to me to stay because I have this big idea and I think it's going to be huge. And then many of them left, but most of them stayed actually. And then some of them tripled down with nothing, with just like, hey, I believe you for making this decision, which is insane to me till this day,
awesome.
Right? Which is like the magic of Silicon Valley.
Yeah, those are the good angels. They get it. I love it. So, and then you had this, can you, snapshot, I remember, so this is actually around the time I met you, where you were going through this process of like, hey, I want to start a better business. And you had all these different ideas. Like, how did you hone down on this one? And were you running tests? Or were you just doing like the top-down analysis of like big markets, where can I make money? Like, how were you doing it?
Yeah. So, yeah, I've talked about this publicly a bunch, so might be repetitive for other people who've heard, but very simply, I came into the process thinking, hey, I was given bad advice, where the advice of everyone in Silicon Valley was the only way to pick an idea is you got to solve your own problems. And the only problems you have as a mid-20s urban millennial who worked at like a bank for 2 years is the same ideas that everyone's been trying to solve in the early 20 teens. Delivery, how to get a job, some other obscure thing that you're dealing with, but maybe doesn't apply to the rest of the world. So once I realized that that there were a lot of companies in my YC batch that were successful that didn't pick their ideas that way, I said, hey, I think I should choose something where I have more of an edge as a founder and is much more blue ocean and is more interesting. And so for me, that was something at the intersection of logistics and Latin America. And so did more top-down research and ended up picking what Nuvocargo is because I saw the success of companies all over the world doing something similar. And I said, someone is going to do this in my region. And at the intersection of the US and Latin America, I think I'm one of the few people in the world who's really well suited for this specific idea. And so I think that part was top down. And then what was bottoms up was the rest of the execution after that, which is what I had learned from YC, like pick something, talk to your customers, launch something, grow every week. But the problem was I did all that with my previous idea. And then when I peaked up and looked back, I've been doing all this advice, but there wasn't a good business model. There wasn't a big enough market. So I said, I'm not making that mistake again. I'm going to pick something with a great market, great business model, and then I'll do all the other stuff I learned from YC, which is not to be like an MBA student, be much more micro, interview your customers, find creative ways to do a lot with very few resources, grow every week, pick a specific metric, right? And so I think this was a more blended approach between what I had seen work and all the YC advice, which obviously has a lot of truth to it. But I think you have to be careful not to follow that stuff blindly when you're a founder like me who just have like a business background, right?
Yeah, and I think like when you read it, I've been reading like at least PG stuff, but then YC stuff since I was like 17 or something like that, and it's almost like the Bible of startups, which is as problematic. Like I think it's a fair comparison where like they're looked at as dogmatic truths about the world. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not true. It's just one way of looking at the world, and it's not the only way. So the way I would describe like the category of building you're doing is there's two areas. One is like just, hey, identify problems and see if you can build something. The other one I like, and I think it's maybe we disagree with the categorization, is fast follows in a slightly different segment of a market, right? So like there are other players in a space. You think there is like 2 or 3 things they're doing poorly and they haven't addressed this part of the market. And that part of the market is still a multi-billion-dollar business to build.
Yeah, I think that's a fair description. Again, I wouldn't call it fast follows because as you learn about the intricacies of applying X for Y in another geography, you realize it's extremely different in 100 different ways. But I think the overall concept of something that can become, this actually happens to me a lot, is YC founders will reach out because I wrote a post about how I pivoted, and now I have like 100 data points of YC founders pivoting. And now when people reach out to me and ask me, hey, I need to pick a new idea, I will almost not listen to anything. I'll just ask with a simple question. Are you in this to do something you're passionate about, or are you trying to build a successful venture-backed company? Because for me, those are two different things. There's a lot of people, including people you and I know, that really want to be building for a specific segment and a customer segment, and they're passionate about it. But the odds of you finding like a problem naturally, and then that can also be a business that gets to 100 million ARR in 5 years and can be venture backable, you're just making it really hard for yourself. And so I think if you want to build a business that can be venture backable, you do have to look at examples where the incumbents are very large or startups have gotten to that scale in a compressed amount of time, and then figure out what's your innovative spin. Like that is an approach to startups that for me is 100x less popular to talk about, but is talked about when I would grab coffee chats with experienced YC partners, with fourth-time founders, of how they pick their ideas. So I know this is how it's done, but no one likes to talk about it because it's less poetic than, and then I couldn't pay my rent and I figured this thing out and boom, now we're worth $100 billion, right? Which happens like one time a century.
One
right?
out of like 1,000. Yeah, totally. And it, there is a poetic version of it for me actually, is that, hey, I am like building the economy here, instead of trying to like change the game, which is, I think, admirable. And I think plenty of people should do it. I want to get a bunch of people around me rich and build like value in this system. And I think that's interesting. And I can focus on that for like 5 to 10 years.
I mean, we're creating hundreds of jobs in Latin America, bringing Silicon Valley best practices. The industry is like the backbone of global trade, which is the thing that connected humans for thousands of years, right? It's just you're picking something that makes sense, and then you're just focusing all your efforts on execution instead of choosing something where even if you solve every existential startup problem, it still might not work because you didn't think through the business model. So it's just an approach. I'm not saying it's the approach, and it probably doesn't work for most people, but I think people should talk about different approaches to picking ideas because they all want to obsess over the YC gospel approach. And I think even, like I said, even YC knows
they're
this
waking
now.
up to it because they've missed on enough of these. They're not attracting the founders that like look at that advice and say, that's just bad advice. I'm going to build something different, right? So you started Nuvocargo and you decided to find a co-founder for this one. So why did you do that, and how did you find him?
So I had always been trying to find a co-founder. I think one little known fact about me is when I was alone with my sabbatical and looking for ideas and then started with the lobby, I was going to WeWork alone every day and setting my schedule. So that's a pretty lonely life. And all the advice online was like, including the YC gospel, you need a tech co-founder. I agree with that advice, but it's really hard to attract someone that you think is incredible. Why would they join a 24, 25-year-old with no credentials, with a little bit of money? Like, that's really hard. So what I had done during the lobby was build a network of potential CTOs, add them to my monthly update, and show them how we were like making progress and hustling. And one of them was Sam Blackman, who's now my co-founder and our CTO. And he was the head of engineering at Common. One of his direct reports almost joined me into YC as a co-founder. So building my network of potential engineers and CTOs. And then when I decided to pivot, it coincided that Sam was like, look, I really liked you. I didn't like your other idea. Let's grab a whiskey and see if we build something together. So when I pivoted, he was kind of there and open and finally in the headspace of maybe this sounds interesting. And then as I went through the idea maze, we would look at some ideas together. And then finally I decided on this idea and convinced him to join like in month 2 or 3, right? I think it was March, April 2019 when we started the whole thing.
Yeah, and it was super early. So he came on from the beginning. And yeah, so I definitely want you to tell this story because I thought that was like the most interesting thing of like how hard it is in the space you're in. So I think you're like an ops heavy tech enabled business, right? And that, like we're very comfortable calling both of our business tech enabled services businesses. And how did you needed to, I remember something around the licensing that was very hard. Like, I guess also like just tell everyone, what is Nuvocargo? What problem do you guys solve? And how did you have to get into it in terms of licensing?
Yeah, so Nuvocargo is very simply, so for those who don't know, every physical product in the room you're sitting in or I'm sitting in, Nima, whether it's your AirPods, your t-shirts, your laptop, your glass that I'm having water from, like absolutely every product around us goes through supply chains. And what does supply chain mean? It's a jargony way of saying like the process of manufacturing the goods in the country that they're made, all the way from them getting delivered to your house as a consumer, right? Like all of that can be considered part of the supply chain. And businesses that make these products have supply chains. And so what we do at Nuvocargo is there's a part of the supply chain, which is the process of moving the goods from the country where they're manufactured, from a facility, to the country where they're going to be distributed or sold. And that process of moving a truckload of goods from Mexico to the US or the US to Mexico, which can have 14, 15 different stakeholders, has different currencies, languages, you have to find the trucks, you have to tap into a transportation network. There's all sorts of complexities. We are aiming to digitize and make more modern that age-old process. And we do it with a business model called freight forwarding. And there's tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of freight forwarders in the world. The biggest are worth $5, $10, $50 billion, publicly traded with 2 to 4% market share. And they were founded hundreds of years ago. So we're reinventing that business model with software, with venture capital, and with a modern startup mindset. And we focus specifically on goods that move over the road between Mexico and the US to start, which is the world's biggest trade lane. It's bigger than US-China, where Flexport has built like an $8 billion business, and many other companies that many people here might know of, right? So that's what we do.
And as the thinking that you're going to aggregate some of these existing players, like why would I guess there's like 10 or 15 stakeholders. So that's a lot of stakeholders to begin with. Like who are you helping now? And like, I assume you want to be helping all of those people with tech, but who are you helping right now?
The nice thing is you don't have to start by helping everyone. You have to start by helping the person who makes the purchasing decision for the transportation, which is the shipper. So let's give you a simple example. Let's say it's a tequila or mezcal brand in New York that makes their tequila and mezcal in Mexico. And so they're the ones that need to get their goods from the distillery delivered to their warehouse here in New York. Now, for that process, they would probably need to hire 7 to 15 different companies, depending on the complexity of their supply chain. So you go to them and tell them, hey, I can help you with this. And then my B2B marketplace on the back end is helping coordinate a lot of those services first externally. And then our roadmap is really to bring a lot of those things in-house and do it ourselves, whether it's the licenses to import and export to file with the government. We can now do that ourselves. Whether it's finding you the truck on the Mexican side, the US side, we can do that now as well. And then there's others, like if you need to procure insurance for the goods or something like that. Over time, Nuvocargo is bringing all of those in-house, so you can just deal with us. And that will give you structured data on your shipments end to end that you typically would not have. It would live on emails and faxes and phone calls, and then use that data to understand your supply chain and have really robust insights on what's going on, so you can find ways to have more efficient routes, safer for your trucks, lower cost, etc.
Yeah, I love it. So I would go from like dealing with something like 5 to 10 people or 10 businesses to just one.
One or today with us, it's like 3, but it will be 1 over time. Like that's the thesis, right?
That seems like a very big improvement. Like I would take that deal if I were to shop it. So okay, that makes sense. And then there's like technology involved there, and there's all these optimizations you can do because there's technology.
Yeah, it's really communications, right? It's communications. It's integrating. Where's my truck? Instead of chasing them down, we have a GPS integration. You can look at it on our platform. Where's this document of what my goods are worth, so they can get across the border? We have that because we're integrated. We've procured that paperwork, or we've created it because we have the right licensing in house to do that ourselves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, until it just becomes much more smooth and efficient, right?
Yeah. And what did you have to do to get started? Because you can't just go and do this stuff. You can't just ship stuff, right?
Yeah, you can't. Good question. So all I knew when we started is we wanted to do this business model for trade between the United States and Latin America. That's my background, right? And I was lucky that in maybe month 1 or 2, I had gone to a conference in Vegas, the first logistics tech conference ever for the most important logistics publication. And it felt so old school that was what made me excited. I was like, wow, there's so much opportunity here. But also that's why it's so complex. And someone there I met said, hey, because I would go around telling people, hey, I'm backed by YC. I have like hundreds of thousands in the bank and I want to build something. I want to build this. And so people found it really intriguing and refreshing. I was 25 or 26 or whatever. And one person I met there, his name is Graham Parker, who's the founder of another company, said, hey, I have someone in Mexico that you should meet. And I think they would sell you, if you're willing to pay a little bit of money, their freight forwarder with all these licenses that other companies we know take years and years to get, right? And so I actually did 2 things. One, I went down to visit so I could shadow and actually understand what people do, because that was the YC muscle of like seeing the customer pain point, seeing the processes. I could do none of that from afar. So I would visit freight forwarders in New York and this, and then when I heard about this one, I just flew down there. And then I built such a good relationship with the owner of that company. His name is Josh Wolf. He has another extremely successful financial services business in the logistics world. He ended up being like, hey, I believe in you. give me, I want to be an equity investor, so I'll sell you the company for no cash, and let's build this thing. So he was extremely reasonable, and he was incredible, and that really jumped us off. And when that happened, Sam, my co-founder, heard that, and he's like, okay, that sounds like a really big deal, and we have money. And then investors heard about that, and then this momentum that I feel like you need to get startups going just came together in 60 days, where we had licenses, we had revenue, we had the employee running that company. And then we started getting more investment. And then I had my technical co-founder. And that's just like a classic example of how momentum compounds after like a lot of months and years of talking with the tech co-founders and learning about this. And that really got us started. And that was about April, May 2019. That company was doing ocean and air shipments, actually. And that's not, we decided we didn't want to do that. So we had to spend 3 months learning and actually decide to shut down all the revenue, which was very small. And then in August or September, we started moving the first trucks between the US and Mexico. But now we had someone who knew how to do this. We had licenses. We learned a bit more, and we already had some customers that we could learn from. And then we just did the YC thing: pick a number, grow it every month, and just hustle until it's a big company, right?
So is the license they allow you to just ship anything that's not yours across the border? That's kind of what the license take. What is that? What is it that you need exactly?
There's multiple licenses. So I just didn't want to get into the jargon, but I'll summarize it with: one license is for you to legally import the goods into the US. That's you filing an entry with Customs and Border Patrol saying, hey, this is a truck of tequila. And they're believing you because you have this certification that requires an FBI background check. Like Flexport publicly says it took them 3 years to get this. That's why we knew it was a big deal to get that license. And then the other 2 or 3 licenses are more like, hey, you are certified to be a freight forwarder by the Federal Maritime Commission for Ocean or the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Association. And then associated with that is all this like insurance bonds you need to have. So they had done a lot of that work in this LLC that we acquired. And it came with one person who's also still in Nuvocargo. Her name is Cristina Rodriguez, who I was just shadowing like a maniac so I could understand absolutely everything she did every day. And then I understood what freight forwarding really was, right?
Yeah, that's lovely. That's like the best studying you can do is just be in it, right? And I think this is one of those other paths of potentially starting companies is just go work in that industry that you think there is something in. You just
100%.
happen to like acquire one of those companies that you could learn all of it from, which is wonderful.
That was a good shortcut. Yeah, it was a good shortcut. Because I was clueless. Like, just to be clear, I'm also very honest. I did not, yes, my dad had a small logistics business, but I was completely clueless about what we were trying to do. I just knew it could be large, and I had some building blocks culturally. And so I was on a race to, let's say, make my learning curve as steep as possible and learn really, really fast, right? Because that was my hypothesis. If it took me 18 months in the lobby to be considered an expert in recruiting, which I didn't consider myself, but enough that I could be knowledgeable and have interesting insights, I said, I'll bite the bullet for 9 to 18 months and just be the dumbest person in the room. But then I will know enough, and then I can spend the next decade just building this thing into something much bigger than what the lobby could have ever been, right?
And so your fundraise again was same entity?
Same entity.
Which is super nice of you, I think. And I'm sure there's a lot of thought. I remember actually there was a lot of thought what went behind it when you were deciding that, hey, I have this idea now. But yeah, tell me why, I guess, like you didn't just shut down and start from scratch.
Yeah, it wasn't so altruistic. So I was a single non-tech founder. We had raised at what I considered a very high valuation, $8 million, like $1 million. So it was very low dilution.
At the time, that was very good.
That was very good, right? And then I gave money back, so that removed more dilution. So I said, if I started again, am I going to have a cap table this good where I have YC, most of the equity? I don't think so. I would probably just raise at a lower price. So it wasn't that altruistic. It was like, hey, I was so obsessed with YC. I'm like, I want to be a successful YC company since they gave me a shot. And I think it's a better cap table than I could build if I started from scratch, because I had no credentials. I was like a guy who tried an idea for 18 months or 12 months and it didn't really work. So for me, it wasn't that altruistic. It was like, hey, this is a good excuse. And then I don't have to do all the legal work. I already have money in the bank. People know what I'm doing. We just get to work, right? So it was actually, I think, a very practical choice. And then my co-founder came and got a bunch of equity, and then we started hiring people and raising money. And then it just became like a normal cap table, I would say, where it wasn't like those companies where you've raised a ton of money and diluted like crazy, and then it makes more sense to shut down, right? It was actually a better deal, I think, to keep going.
Yeah, it's almost like, you know how people do these search entities where they're like raise a bunch of money and like, I'm going to go find a companies, because you were a solo founder and you stopped fast enough. It feels like that's kind of like this start was, oh yeah, I just searched for a very good idea and now we're scaling it.
Yeah, totally.
What do you call search funds? Yeah.
Search funds. Yeah, that's a very MBA thing. I have a lot of friends doing them right now, actually. Yeah.
The classic. So, yeah, one of the things that I feel like you're extremely good at, and this comes up like every time we have one of these therapy groups, is that you're a very good fundraiser. And I think it's part of the muscle you have to build to do VC or venture-backed businesses. The first one, there's all this momentum. You went through it. You got this license. You have a co-founder. I think you raised some money right around then again to like...
We raised a little bit of angel money. We were going to do a bigger one. That fell apart. That was a big learning. And then 9 months later, raised a seed round. And then we raised like 2 or 3 more since then, more proper rounds.
And then, by this time you raised the seed, you had metrics to look at, right? You were building and you were scaling, which is wonderful. And I assume you recommend that as just to show traction. It's much easier to raise that way than anything else. But is there a version of this thing that you said, no, like keep going and do like the R&D process before you raise your next round? Or would you say get to numbers as soon as possible?
Good question. I don't know how to recommend in the general sense. I can just illustrate to your listeners like my state of mind. I was in a desperate state of mind. I was like one of the columns in picking my ideas was time to revenue because I was like, I am not going to be a zombie startup founder. Like that was my obsession. I don't know if that's healthy or not. So for me, so that's why buying the company was so interesting because we got to revenue and then it was already more revenue than I had ever gotten in the lobby. So it was like tens of thousands of gross revenue per month. And then realizing, and I think you just have to know what the core metric is for your company. When you're doing one of these tech-enabled companies, at the end of the day, it is like GMV or transactions. If I was building Superhuman or something like that, then I would obviously build it differently. I would think about how do I be in beta and build a product that's incredible for 2 years. But at that time, I'm like, what are businesses that I could be well suited for? Something that starts making money quite quickly and I know I'm on the right track and then I can let the software kind of catch up. And so for me, that was the North Star. It was like, I'm going to launch something, I'm going to get the metric, and then I'm going to take this one metric, rally the entire company around just growing at 20, 30, 40, 50% per month. And we just did that for 5 months. We grew on average 70% per month. And then we raised our seed round, which to your point, I'm laughing as you asked the question, because I'm like, yeah, you're right. In the past 2 years, everyone's just been raising seed rounds with nothing, right? Just like stories. And I never did that. I just didn't think that was a thing you did back in 2019 or 2020.
Yeah, and I think it's always happened to some degree, but it was the worst it had been, I think, the last couple of years. And as someone that like helps companies and now and invests in them, I think the correction in the market is probably fair. That's happening right now. But I think you're immune to it because you have numbers to back up what you're saying, which is wonderful. So you did the services essentially from the beginning. The software started creeping in. And you have to build both a services business and a high like execution excellent software company. So how do you do that? What do you where do you put your own resources or like your mindset?
It's very, very difficult. It's very, very difficult. Yeah, it's extremely difficult. And I don't want to sugarcoat it. That's why when we joke internally, like, aren't you guys worried about the competition? I'm like, no, no, I'm not. Good luck. It's a business with a lot of complexity for 3 reasons. Number one, because of what you just said, you have to build a freight forwarder and a software company. Number 2, because it's a B2B marketplace. So you have marketplace dynamics on matching supply and demand on both sides of the border. And number 3, it's online to offline. There's a way to do this that's relatively offline that customers are used to. And so you have to map out those data inputs, make it more online. And so at this point, we moved the first, like I said, US-Mexico trucks late 2019. So we've been at this for 2.5 years. And I would say that the first year and change probably was just about honing in on the right roadmap and getting the right people around the table because we were so under-resourced, right? Our head of product, Anaid, who came from Dropbox, grew up on the border. She's incredible. She joined us the summer of 2020. So we've been at it for like 9 or 12 months. It took her a few months to really understand the complexities of the business. And then we really started feeling like we were executing. We were still a seed company then, right? So I think that it's very difficult, but it's going to be a very powerful moat for us at scale because we're very focused on this one trade lane, this mode of transportation, and mapping out all the permutations of northbound, southbound shipments and understanding that was difficult. I think what I would say is you needed to grow the core business fast enough to raise enough capital that you could fuel the core business and invest in product and engineering. And also, when you're a marketplace, you have to build liquidity where your margins can be really tight early on until you start getting scale. That's why I think we've crossed some of the most existential and difficult parts of the business now. And now it feels really good because we have a lot of capital and yada, yada, right?
But there's two questions I have, but before we get into it, can you just define marketplace liquidity real quick for everybody?
Yeah. So for me, marketplace liquidity is, let's say you go on Amazon.com and you want to find a lacrosse ball. I needed to buy one because something in my back was screwed up. And you don't find lacrosse balls. That means that Amazon doesn't have liquidity in the marketplace from buyers and sellers, right? There's not enough buyers, so there's no sellers for lacrosse balls, and I'm a buyer, but there's no sellers, so there's no liquidity. So in our case, that means that we needed to have enough supply and demand from people who want to move goods and trucking companies that want to move it for you. And we're still building that. It's going to take us a while because it's such a big market, but we do have liquidity now on certain lanes and certain regions between the US and Mexico. And so building that out from zero is the classic marketplace issue, chicken and egg problem, which takes a while and is expensive to solve, right?
Yeah, what was going to be my second question is like, how subdivided is your liquidity market? Like, you have to have lots of different regions, and it sounds like routes. Are those the only two dimensions, or are there like many more?
There's so the nice thing about geographically is 40% of U.S.-Mexico trade concentrates on one border crossing, which is Laredo, Texas, or Laredo, if you want my Hispanic pronunciation or American one. And so we started there, and then there's 6 or 7 routes to and from Laredo from Mexico. So that actually concentrated things and made it a little bit easier. And we just made a lot of decisions to be focused. We said no to other border crossings. We said no to other equipment types. We said no to other countries, whereas other startups in the space just expanded everywhere. And maybe their strategy will work. I think that introduces way too much complexity and product overhead. We'll see. I think time will tell. And so then when you have the geographic dimension, then you have to choose equipment types. Like, will you move refrigerated goods, dry van goods? So we only move today 53-foot dry van full truckloads between the US and Mexico crossing through Laredo. So getting to that level of specificity has taken us a while, but that's like 80% of the stuff or 90% of the stuff that crosses through that border crossing. So it's a very, very big market. It's like 10 million truckloads a year, but getting to that level of specificity has been painful and difficult. And now I think we're really good at that, and we need to get much better at it. But those were the dimensions, right?
Yeah, and I think it makes a lot of sense. When you're trying to master a process, you have to like simplify it as much as possible first, and then you can introduce. And first of all, you get to get good at mastering processes. That's the first thing you have to learn as an organization, right? So the other question I had for you is around this like software/services thing. Walk me through the org design. Like, are the software teams embedded in the ops teams? Are they separate? And there is like a product management organization that talks to them and thinks of them as the users? Like, how do you work?
Yeah. So we've interviewed probably the best companies in the world at this, and I can tell you that no one seems to feel like they have the right answer. They all say that every org design is by design flawed, and there's some trade-offs. What we've landed on today is we have a business equation. Basically, we learned, hey, when businesses are complex, the best thing you can do, and we learned this through the YC growth program as well, which we did last year, map out the levers that grow your business. And so we mapped out a business equation where there's demand, there's supply, then there's marketplace dynamics, and then there's kind of operations that wraps it all together. So those 4 things. And those are the main functions. And then everything else, whether it's product, finance, legal, these things are kind of supporting and servicing those functions. And so that's how we've built it. So product is kind of embedded in each function, but they have a vision and a roadmap of how things need to be, and they're building products in verticals, one for the demand side, one for the supply side, one for the marketplace side. And that's what we've landed on today, and we'll see if that changes in the future.
Product people and the engineers are literally part of, like, let's say the supply team or the demand team, or
no, they're like implanted, if you want to think of it that way, and they have a roadmap for those teams, but their career paths and everything are still with our head of product because that's what they want. But they're like our Elena, our product manager for Carrier, she lives and breathes only products for the supply side of the marketplace, and will collaborate with those teams and study their actions and interview those customers, and has a roadmap for them.
Yeah, and then there is like, these customers are both like internal ops people you have, and then external people that you work with. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think that's like a tough problem you're solving there, and that wisdom you just mentioned of like org designs are flawed by design or by their nature, and there's trade-offs. I think that seems to be the reality every time you speak to a founder who's trying to design these things. And do you feel like you will change it over time? Like it sounded like the answer is yes, but maybe you're not seeing it right now.
I mean, I just don't think I'm arrogant enough to know that I know more than a lot of people who've done this before. And the more we've interviewed people, whether it's that scaled Flexboard or Convoy or other complex B2B marketplaces, org designs happen all the time. And I think it's because even if something feels like it works well at this scale, if you grow fast enough, which we've been lucky to always grow pretty fast, you will have to evolve it to the new level of scale or the new learnings, or maybe your product roadmap is doing so well that it automated some big thing that broke a bunch of old processes that you had. So I would imagine it has to change, but I don't know if it changes. I hope it won't change too much, because those reorgs, this is something we learned also by interviewing all these execs that were trying to get to hire us from big companies. The amount of time these bigger companies that we respect spend just like reorging and changing stuff and not really building is insane. So my personal mission is to try to find a way for us to do that as little as we need to, right?
Has that happened yet at all, where you've had to like redesign the org to some extent?
Yes. Yeah, it already happened once, I would say. One big way and then one other small way that didn't really. Yeah.
How did that go? What did you learn?
I think one thing I learned, which is maybe funny about humans, other people might look at it cynically, is people will always find a way to game the system, if that makes sense. So I'll give you an example. We have salespeople basically on both sides of the marketplace bringing the demand and the supply, and you have to pay them commissions. And the way you set up the incentives for, are they optimizing for top line? Are they optimizing for margin? Are they optimizing for new customers? Like absolute number of customers or revenue, like all these things, as well as you think them through, people will find a way to game them so that they find the one edge case, which you didn't want them to do, isn't good for the business, but is good for them individually. That will happen. And so I think being really thoughtful about incentives in org design is really important. And then also being thoughtful about feedback loops, because I think right now we're going through a process where it feels like some teams are too siloed, and now we have to make sure that they have the right voices in the room to move faster. So I think those are the types of trade-offs we're always making. It's around, is it too siloed? Is it too jumbled together so you can't break things down? Do you have the right incentives so that every single person knows, if I move this number this week, I am contributing to the growth of the business? So I think it's a lot of learnings around getting those things right, and that is really hard.
Yeah, I mean, this resonates with me a lot, where there's been stories I've heard of people like working at Facebook and Google and like squeezing out every perk that is possible. And I used to think, well, that's just something that happens to like very big companies. Why would it happen in like a startup of like 40 people? And then you start putting up perks and then you'll see people like maximizing everything.
Exactly.
And you're like, okay, well, I understand now. And it's like a human scale problem to some extent, but also it's just when you give people games, they want to win at the game, no matter what, even if they care about the collective to some extent and are altruistic, they will still think individually to some extent,
yeah.
Right?
I don't know if in peer mill you feel this way. The other learning for me is I consider myself kind of a warm leader, like get along with people, really care about them, and obviously hold the performance bar really high. But I've always known most people at the company. We went from, I think early last year, 25 people to now 180 in like 16 months or something like that. And there's just people that have joined and left already that I have never met now. And that's insane. And so you also learn that the reason you have to design these things for the right incentives is because it's not just going to be like the early stage feel where everyone knows each other. It is going to be at some point, if you're in it to build a big business, you're going to build something that outscales you and your time and the amount of things you can catch. So it just has to be well thought out from a number of different perspectives so that it works well at a 10x, 3x, 5x bigger scale, right?
And so how do you, I guess walk me through that. So I completely agree, obviously, with that. And how do you do it where, let's say you want to introduce a new process or a new incentive, like how do you battle test it before it goes out?
I'm really bad at this, so I don't even want to pretend like I know what I'm doing here. I mean, we've talked about this in our therapy group. I feel like some founders have strengths, others have weaknesses. My weakness is most definitely around great ops process and ops excellence and accountability. And I'm trying to hire, and I have been hiring for that to complement me on our leadership team. What I see our leaders do, which come from like Uber and Amazon and Kavak and these massively complex operational businesses at scale, is they're just very good at going from, I see the problem, diagnose it. They'll actually build up some visual way for us to understand the problems. And because they have some battle scars of how they've built their ops teams, they already have they already have learnings of, hey, if you do it this way, people are going to game it this way and that way and this way. And then they'll launch it, and then they'll make sure to also budget time to build in measurements so you can see things that you can correct right after you launch it. But I do think this is not the type of thing where you can launch something and change it in 3 months, because people will get mad. Like, we've had salespeople get quite angry that we've had to change commission structures 5 times, right? That's not. So I think you have to be nimble and iterative, but understand that when you're doing it in org design, you're doing it with real humans and their jobs and what they thought they needed to succeed. Like, I'll give you an example. We had a salesperson who was going to close a customer that moved refrigerated freight, and we had just decided as a leadership team, hey, we're accommodating all these crazy options for refrigerated freight, and last month we moved like 2 versus 1,000 of non-refrigerated freight, so let's remove it. And the salesperson was like, wow, I had worked so hard on this customer, you guys took it away from me. And so we know that there's a real human cost when we make changes, so you have to be careful, but also I think you have to make those decisions. So I think balancing that is not my strength, but I think we've hired leaders that are very, very good at that.
And do you, I assume there was a bunch of communication. You do try to get them to understand why you ended up making this decision to begin with, right? It's not like you're going to cut it out.
Yes, but this is the issue. Yeah, when you're really hyper scaling, you think you address 6 issues like that, and then 3 more pop up that you forgot about or didn't know. And so you just have to build the muscle of, hey, when people bring it to you, really explain it to them. And again, I think we have our strength as a company is our culture, and people understand that things are being done thoughtfully and with good intention. But it is going to happen if you're moving fast enough. Otherwise, you're probably moving very slow, right? Like, you're going to have problems with these things.
Yeah, you're almost spending too much time on worrying about the repercussions of things as opposed to getting shit done.
You just can't. It's much better to spend time thinking intrinsically, what is the right move for the company with the information I have, and then executing on it. I think you can get good at mitigating some of the downsides of that, as long as the people that you work with know that you're doing it in service of the company being better overall, because that's what everyone wants if they work at a startup.
I'm going to ask you more of an unknown question, because I don't know what you do here. You just mentioned around how you're generally a super positive and nice guy, which I can attest to, right? At the same time, this is a somewhat of a ruthless industry, in that there's very small amounts of margins, which shit that means just you cannot make that many mistakes. And also the cherry on top of that is the scale. You just talked about, you went from 60 something to 180 something in less than 2 years. How do you make sure you're not disconnected from the people still? Are these now just flowcharts in your head, and you're just dealing with your main VPs? Are you talking to people? What are you doing?
Yeah, so it is very difficult, but again, could be wrong. I never like to make bold statements, because there's probably someone at Nuvocargo who may disagree given their own personal experience. But the feedback that I consistently get is that I'm very nice, almost too nice. So maybe it's something I need to work in the other direction. And I think I've built certain habits and systems inside our company as CEO where my voice is heard and felt by people, and people can reach out to me if there's something specific. But at some point, you have to realize that if the CEO is the person who solves all these people problems, something is very wrong with your company, right? Because you're not having the right management and the right leadership, and your managers aren't good people managers. So I'll tell you some things I do, but by far the highest leverage thing is hiring people that have values similar to yours, that think the way you do about building a great place to work, so that you don't have to worry. I actually think my leaders are better than me at people management. So it's a waste of time for me to try to interject and try to show my presence in things where I know they've got it, right? And I will mostly interject when I feel like that's not true for whatever team or something that's going on. And I think that scales way better. But to answer your question, there's a bunch of things that I do to make my message as CEO or presence felt. So one thing that we took from one of our investors, David Vélez, the CEO of Nubank, we asked him, why is everyone raving about Nubank's culture, right? Why is everyone saying it's so great? It's thousands of people. And he gave me some examples, but he said it's really about speaking with, your action. So one thing he still does to this day, which I've now basically with his blessing copied, is a monthly presentation for all of our new hires, where I will personally walk everyone through the values and the culture and examples of what it means to live our values and what it doesn't. And I give them the space to ask me questions, to push back. And that way, the first time we actually get to speak, because I don't get to speak with everyone in the interview process anymore, is about this thing that's about the culture and how I expect people to behave and what the culture is like here, and what it means to be a bad culture fit and a good culture fit. And that's good. The other one is there's all hands every 2 weeks, and I'm the one speaking a lot of the time so people can hear me. And so building in, I think, feedback loops like that. I also was in every interview until we were about 120 people. And so people learned how I interview. People would be listening in. We have scorecards when you interview people, like what's a good culture fit, what's not. And so I think it's enough of like rote, repetitive work of hiring and culture that now the leaders below you understand. And it's not just me, by the way. We define the culture with our leaders. So coming together and realizing this is what this company is about in terms of culture and values, and then how do we scale that with systems, with interview processes, with et cetera. And then I think that's the only thing that can endure, and that's why big companies do these things that we find fluffy, like values and strategy and mission. And I think I've really learned how valuable those things are now that we're getting to a point where I just can't talk with most people, right?
Yeah, I mean, I find it like extremely valuable. And I remember being young and an employee and working in places that had those things written, and there was like a distinct difference between the ones that walk the walk and just talk the talk. So you can also see that there, like, someone has like grabbed it as a task and they've done it versus like, oh no, this is like how we're going to scale this culture. So we're going to build it into the essence of what it's like to be here. Are those like bi-weekly things the only mass communication you're doing to the team, or are you like writing? Are you mostly like, is it video, audio? Like, how are you talking to your team?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like scheduled touch points, the bi-weekly all hands, the monthly culture sessions, obviously in the main Slack channel, we have a bot with my face spitting out the updates so on good. Revenue a few times per day. So people can, because I used to do that manually. So we scaled that. So now people see my face with like a robotic Terminator thing where with the revenue updates to make sure we're on track to hit our goals. So there's little touch points here and there like that. There's been times where, I don't know, there was a time a few months ago where I felt like people were too stressed about this massive migration. I recorded myself on a Loom and told everyone how I saw these things in 6 different areas of the company that I thought were great. It's hard, but that's the hard work, right? I think you have some scheduled, some are more ad hoc, but just feeling a pulse for the company and the organization is, I think, the hardest part as you grow. And in this remote environment that we are, even though Nuvocargo has a strong in-office component, it still has a lot of people remote. We're not all in the same city, so there's a lot of work there that we're always doing to try to make sure people feel the culture and feel the presence of their leaders.
Yeah, I think that the vibe setting is the way I would put it, is like way harder in remote. Like I write a weekly email that I also record myself speak as audio format. So I have like basically a weekly podcast to my whole team, and I call it the weekly pulse, just like you just use the word pulse, right? And it's like the equivalent of like a stand-up you would do in like a normal office setting, but we're out of like 7 time zones, so the stand-up doesn't work, right? I feel you. I think it's hard. I don't know if there's like a standard model you can copy, like the stand-up in an engineering team or anything like that. It's a tough one.
I mean, this type of question you're asking was literally what we talked about for 12 weeks in the YC growth program. And again, the conclusion was there's no right answer. There's things that a lot of CEOs do you can learn from. So like the weekly email was one we saw a lot of CEOs that YC growth talks about. Other tactics amongst your leadership team. What I heard from the Nubank founder. I mean, I candidly think one of the jobs of a CEO that's scaling the company is to find as much of those data points as you can, and then pick the ones that work and that feel authentic to your company's culture and leadership style. But I think that's my biggest learning. There isn't a perfect way to do any of this, and anyone who tells you there is probably 3 months away from everything breaking and them realizing that it doesn't work. So yeah.
Yeah, I have like 2 more questions for you. So one is around this thing you just mentioned, which is like, oh, your job is to go out there and like find all the potential permutations of solutions. Like, and you're quite talented at that. Can you walk me through, how do you do it when you're like, hey, let's say random problem, like, hey, we have a cash flow liquidity problem where we're putting our money up here and it has to come back and I have to solve this problem. I have no idea how to solve this problem. I'm going to have to find a solution. Go. What do you do?
Yeah, I mean, this really goes back to like the lobby and everything about like how I got into YC and how I got a job in banking. I think I've just developed this addiction to the fact that this problem that I'm losing sleep over and being extremely inefficient over, someone out in the world, or 20 people or 50 people in the world, have already thought about for a year, tried 20 things that didn't work, and then figured out the one that did. So why would I spend my time, especially in startups where every month is so valuable if you're trying to move at hyper growth? You just don't have that time, right? That's my belief. It could be wrong. Again, I'm not saying we're not gospel here. I like different perspectives. So for absolutely everything we've done, where there's an unsolvable problem, including some I have right now, I am consistently using my network to find someone who has solved that problem in a close enough way that I can learn some of the core tenets, then maybe hear 3 or 4 people and their solutions, and then I will compile that and then make a decision. And I often find that is, and I have examples of that this month, like our head of people was talking about introducing cash bonuses. And I texted 7 CEOs who are angels, realized that they instituted that when they were 1,000 people, not 200 people. And I said, this is too early stage, we're not doing it. And I could only do that with conviction because I got data points from people in similar situations. The cash flow liquidity one you talked about, we actually had something like that in Nuvocargo, and logistics companies have working capital issues. So we were able to find, 3 CPA firms through investors that help specifically logistics companies, get them on the phone with your head of finance, ask them your questions. And more often than not, if you know how to ask the right questions and you're speaking with the right people, you will get clever solutions to your problems. Or at least, this happened to me with org design when I was doing YC growth. You'll speak with 5 people, realize no one knows what the hell they're doing, and then you just pick the one that feels most logical to you. But at least you tried, right?
All the examples you gave was like getting interest from your investors. So it sounds like you're using your investment network quite well. Is that the only path you're going through, or you're like cold emailing people?
No, I mean, all the cold emailing people. Actually, the investor thing is just recent because now we have a big investor network. We've raised a bunch of money. That was not true a year or 2 ago when I was figuring all this stuff out. I think you have to be clever in finding the right introductions. So I'm trying to think of one example. I can't remember who connected me to this guy who was head of sales at a very big trucking tech startup. And I was just starting and I realized that I couldn't get on the phone with customers. I was selling them and I sounded clueless. So we found an arrangement with his startup where he needed help with something. And I said, we'll pay you whatever $1,000 a month. And he flew down to Mexico City with me and he ran interviews for all of our salespeople. And he hired our first 5 salespeople 50 times faster than I would have been comfortable with, because he had done this with hundreds of people, right? And I will do things like our board meetings. We have someone who attends who has scaled US, Mexico, cross-border brokers the old school way to hundreds of millions from zero, because I found him and this guy's perfect and we gave him equity and we started paying him hourly. And he comes to our board meetings so that I don't feel like our board meetings are full of VCs who know nothing about logistics, right? And me, who also has not scaled this before. And so I'll just consistently do this in every aspect of my life. And I think it's a huge shortcut in 100 different ways, right?
Yeah, I would say this is one of your magic points that I've definitely copied over the years. I think there was someone who was asking me internally, like I think our chief of staff is like, how did you figure this out? I'm like, I just called 30 people to figure it out. It was like the most Deepak thing ever. And so,
Love it.
And then, so I guess the last part is just the investment apparatus. Like, I know you wanted some brand names at some point that were specific to your industry and things like that. Like, is that helpful? Would you recommend it? Is money just money? Does it matter?
So here I've learned a lot from Eric and Kareem at Ramp, who I know you know well, the founders of Ramp, the credit card company, if you guys know. I think what I've learned 2 things that could be contradictory. One is your investors are not going to build your company for you, so don't expect that. And people who expect too much of their investors are perpetually unhappy and are the people you always hear complaining about stuff. They didn't fund me for this reason. They didn't help me with that. Like, your job is to make the company successful no matter what, and investors are not going to do that for you. Now, that being true, one thing that I found, and I learned a lot of this from Eric and Kareem, and maybe it's because I started with 41 angels in the lobby, and then I saw how Eric and Kareem raised from, even though they were raising from the most blue chip funds, they made space for like 100 angels in their seed round. You want cheerleaders. You're building a community. You're trying to will something impossible into the world. So I have always had the approach of adding people to the cap table as teammates that add value in some way while keeping low expectations, which is my first point, right? So our seed round was led by NFX and AllVP. Why? Not because I thought they were going to make the company, but hey, NFX is First of all, I love James' career. It's incredible, still an incredible, invaluable CEO, coach, and mentor. So that was 99% of the reason, but they have a good brand. They're Silicon Valley. They know marketplaces. Then AllVP knows Mexico. Then we raised from QED, who knows the fintech stuff. Then we raised from all these Mexican businessmen and families that can help us locally. We raised from whatever, Tiger as a passive investor, big, deep pockets. We've always thought of constructing the cap table, and then angel investors like David Veres from Nubank, who I can call and text with little questions. So I will always find a way. If someone wants to put in 10 million, put in 9, give me $1 million, and I'll split that up with 20 people. Each of them will add something to our company that I might not need on a day-to-day basis, but they're there to call on. And by the way, they build extremely good long-term relationships if you know how to handle it. So that's how I think about it. And I learned that from Eric and Kareem, and then just from examples myself where I can't believe I got this crazy help. Like there's one investor who put 20K in our last round, and he has personally closed 2 execs for us. Like, what if I would have given that 20K to a VC? It's like insane, right? Or whatever, got on us customers. So I think we have 200 people on our cap table, maybe more through indirect SPVs. And I know there's some risk of leakage, and probably people that I don't want have some of our information, but I think the benefits outweigh the cons every day of the week.
Yeah, and that's it. The leakage problem is interesting. I mean, the SPVs is a non-problem because you're not going to get anything, so that's easy, right? I guess I personally think, first of all, I think Kareem and Eric at Ramp have been clearly very thoughtful. This is the part where I think I'm seeing more of, because capital became so cheap over the last couple of years. People were able to be a lot more thoughtful than before. I think you could, in 2017 or 18, if you were fundraising, you would just grab it out of maybe 2 or 3 options you had. In 2019, 2020, it was 40 options. And you're like, well, maybe I could have all of them. And, I think I'm frequently in that 1 million chunk that you talk about, right? Because my check sizes are small and founders are like, hey, we think you're going to be helpful when you grow and things like that. But then the VCs do want to take that over. So at least 2 or 3 deals I was in last year, I couldn't put as much as I wanted because they're like, well, the VC pushed back. We wanted 2 million and now we have 1 million allocation. I want to fit more people. Can you do half the amount that you said you would? And so it is becoming so competitive that the VCs want that 1 million, which is not much in a Series A. But I can see that being very helpful, especially if I think it sounds like you're good at finessing it and keeping and maintaining all these relationships in a way that is useful to you.
Yeah, you have to be good at that. I have a lot of founders that I've angel invested in, and they'll ask me for an example of my investor update, and then I laugh because I'll get 10 updates with the same call out where I say, please. It's in a very nice way. I say, hey guys, there's a lot of you. Please leave me alone. That's not what the wording is, but it's kind of like, hey, we can build a relationship, but people have to respect. I'm not going to hop on calls. I'm not going to, there's a lot of email. We sent out an update yesterday. So many people reaching out with insights. There's someone who I didn't even know sold a company to Zynga for $1 billion, and another person who was at Facebook when they were 700 people. And I said, I need help with this org design issue. And people will respond. Sometimes they won't do anything because I don't have expectations, but then I'm pleasantly surprised at this team that we have. But to your point, I think you have to be good at finessing. You have to be good at saying no. I was really bad at this. Our seed round was very, very oversubscribed, which sounds like a champagne problem, and it is, but it's also super painful to tell people who said, I'll back you before others, tell them no when they said yes to you first and you take someone with a better brand name, whatever, things that everyone understands why you would do them. And so getting good at saying no and convincing people why it's okay to have a smaller check and for the VC to get less, that's, I think it is what you're saying. It's in an environment of abundance, or when you have a CEO that's good at managing those relationships and those dynamics. You don't have to be. At the end of the day, the most important thing is making a successful product in a company. These are things that help. That's it, right?
Well, thank you so much for being on here. It was super fun to get to know the details of the story a little bit more. I appreciate you spending your time, and hope to see you around.
Thanks for having me, Nima.
I'm betting that Nuvocargo continues along the hyper-growth journey with Deepak at the helm. If you're not following our show, tap that follow or subscribe button to get every episode as soon as it's released. Thanks for listening, and until next time.